I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not a soldier. I have never fired a weapon in any official capacity, and on the 2 occasions I fired one unofficially, I missed both times, which is why I remain in records management. My name is Harlan Oss. For 11 years I served as a Terran Interstellar Records Officer, Grade 4, seconded to the Diplomatic Consulate Network. I catalogued shipping manifests, cross-referenced treaty annexes, arbitrated classification disputes between member species whose administrative systems had never been designed to talk to each other, and on one occasion spent 4 months untangling a customs dispute over a misclassified cargo of fermented grain product that 3 different species each claimed was a controlled substance under their own law and a cultural heritage item under someone else's. I won that one on a technicality involving translation ambiguity in a subordinate clause of the Conclave Trade Standards Appendix, which I had read in its entirety, because reading things in their entirety is how I do my job. It remains my professional high point, or it did, until the Vethori Council session of 09. I am telling you this because people hear the story and they want to make it into something it wasn't. They want a hero, a speech, a moment where humanity stood up and declared itself. What actually happened was that a colleague of mine filed a reclassification form. She used the correct cover sheet. She submitted it through the proper diplomatic channel. She did it in the middle of a council session while 53 Vethori high officials were watching her, which took a certain quality of nerve I will not pretend I possess. But the act itself was a paperwork correction. The record should reflect what actually happened. Records are my area. I had been assigned to the Vethori Diplomatic Consulate on the Lara station for 3 years before the council session. The Lara is a conclave waypoint, one of those neutral administrative hubs that exist to give species with incompatible atmospheric requirements a place to conduct business in a pressurized corridor, and to give the conclave bureaucracy somewhere to put its overflow. I had requested the posting. The Lara had the 3rd largest cross-species archival collection in the outer systems, and the Vethori maintained a reading room there that was open to credentialed researchers. And the Vethori archival methodology was something I had wanted to study directly rather than from translated secondary sources. My department head had looked at my transfer request for approximately 2 seconds before approving it, because the Lara had a waiting list of 0, and no one wanted to go there except people who wanted to be near the archive. I am the kind of person who wanted to be near the archive. The reading room was the size of a small hangar, climate-controlled to the precise standard the Vethori specify for their long-form document storage, with air that always felt slightly cool and slightly dry, and smelled faintly of the atmosphere scrubbers, and of the documents themselves, which after extended handling pick up an ambient quality I can describe only as institutional, and which I find, without apology, pleasant. I spent 4 to 6 hours there most days, depending on what was in my work queue. The Vethori archivist staff had become accustomed to me. They did not interact with me socially. That is not the Vethori archival culture. But they did, after the first several months, begin leaving relevant documents on the reading table rather than requiring me to submit a formal retrieval request for each one. That is the closest thing to warmth you receive in a Vethori reading room, and I appreciated it. 3 years of daily proximity to the Vethori archival staff had given me 2 things of practical value. The first was a working knowledge of their filing taxonomy, which is extraordinarily precise, deeply logical, and structured in a way that assumes the world can be sorted into categories that do not overlap. The second was enough experience with their professional culture to read the mandibles, which I have already mentioned, and also to understand the particular quality of confidence that senior Vethori archivists carry. A confidence that is not arrogance exactly, but is the very close cousin of arrogance that you get in people who have been systematically correct about a great many things for a very long time. The Vethori archival tradition was old. Their cataloging caste had been doing this work, by some accounts, for longer than humanity had written history. They were not wrong to trust their system. They had earned that trust. That is what made the footnote matter. The Vethori are insectoid. I mentioned that only because their physical appearance matters to understanding the expression on their faces when things went wrong for them, and that expression is the whole point of the story. They have a chitinous exterior that ranges in color from deep amber to near black, depending on caste and age. Their senior council members are almost entirely black, which gives them a certain gravitas in formal settings that I will admit is effective. They have two large compound eyes that refract light in a way that makes their emotional state difficult to read at first, but after 3 years of daily archival work alongside Vethori colleagues, I had learned to watch the mandibles. Relaxed mandibles meant comfort. Tight mandibles meant concern. Mandibles held absolutely, completely still, as if the Vethori were willing every muscle in their face not to move, meant something had gone very wrong, and they were deciding whether or not to acknowledge it. By the end of that session, I watched 53 sets of Vethori mandibles go from loose and confident to absolutely, completely still. It was something to see. I should back up. The Vethori Compact had been orbiting the question of human membership in the Galactic Conclave for approximately 9 years. Orbiting is my word. The official diplomatic language was evaluating candidacy on an ongoing basis, which in conclave procedure means the same thing it means in any sufficiently bureaucratic structure. We have not decided no, but we have also not decided yes, and we will continue to not decide for as long as is politically convenient. Humanity had applied, met the base criteria, submitted the documentation, and then waited. The Vethori were the largest single voting bloc in the evaluating committee, which meant that the Vethori position was, practically speaking, the committee's position. The Vethori position was that humanity was a minor civilization with charming industriousness and no serious military projection capability. They said this politely always. The Vethori were extremely polite. They had a whole caste whose job was being polite, and another whose job was cataloging things. And I suspect the reason they were so confident in their assessment of humanity is that their cataloging caste was exceptionally good at what it did. I had spent 3 years working in their reading room. I had read their publicly accessible administrative methodology documents. I understood how their taxonomy was constructed, top-level categories with defined subdirectories, each subdirectory governed by a classification standard that specified which items belonged there and which did not. It was a beautiful system. It was consistent and internally coherent, and if you understood the categories, you could find anything in it in under 4 minutes, which I was told was exceptional even by conclave standards. The weakness of a perfectly consistent internal taxonomy is that it assumes all incoming data uses the same vocabulary. It files external material into the category that most closely matches its own classification labels. If the matching label is close but not identical, and the difference between the two labels is documented only in a footnote to an ancillary standards document, the taxonomy files the material correctly according to its own logic and incorrectly according to the originating system's logic. And neither system registers an error, because neither system is wrong from the inside. I knew this because I had watched it happen with minor documents 3 or 4 times during my posting. Small things. A trade tonnage figure that landed in the wrong aggregate because the Terran definition of commercial overlapped with but did not exactly match the Vethori definition. A personnel count that was off by a factor of the reserve-to-active ratio because the two systems counted differently. Each time, the error was small enough that it fell within normal variance, and nobody caught it until a routine audit. Each time I filed a correction notice and moved on. The reserve fleet was not a small thing, but the mechanism was identical. I had not, until the morning of the council session, realized that the mechanism had applied to something of this size. The assessment had not been in my queue until the morning it was distributed to the observer delegation, the day of the session itself. It arrived in my inbox at 6th hour station time. I opened it in the shuttle from the consulate annex to the council station, started reading it over my morning coffee, reached section 3, which was the active naval inventory, read the total, and then went back and read it again because the number seemed low and I had, in my years of processing Terran naval documentation, developed a sense for what Terran naval numbers should look like. Let me be precise about that sense, because it is the kind of thing that sounds vague when you describe it but is actually specific. It is not intuition. I do not trust intuition in archival work. What I had was pattern recognition built from 11 years of reading documents, the same way a copy reader develops a feel for a number that is implausible before they have done the arithmetic to confirm it. When you have read hundreds of Terran naval tonnage figures across hundreds of documents, requisition orders, treaty commitments, deployment summaries, budget allocations, you develop an internal calibration. The number I read in Section 3 fell below that calibration by a margin that was not trivially explainable by treaty commitments alone. I had seen the treaty commitment numbers earlier in the same section. They accounted for a significant deduction, but not enough to produce what I was reading. So I went back and read it again, more slowly this time, and then I went to the classification index in the appendix. The number was not wrong. Active naval tonnage, properly defined, was exactly what it said. But when I got to the classification index in the appendix and saw that the assessment had drawn from the auxiliary support subdirectory for reserve assets rather than the active reserve subdirectory, I put down my coffee, because those two subdirectories are on different branches of the Vethori archival tree, and they map to different columns in the assessment template, and one of them is included in the combat-capable total, and one of them is not. I sat with that for a moment. Then I pulled up the Terran Naval Register on my tablet and confirmed what I already suspected about the classification of the reserve fleet in the Terran system. Then I pulled up the Vethori classification framework from my archival files. I had a copy because I had studied it extensively for my own work, and confirmed how the Vethori system would map a label like reserve, given the framework's own internal logic. Then I found the Fleet Classification Standards footnote, which I had read before in the context of a different cross-species document reconciliation, and read it again. The whole process took 11 minutes. I know because I noted the time when I opened the assessment and noted it again when I sent the message to Voss, and the interval was 11 minutes. 11 minutes to find an error that had been in the system for 9 years, not because I was exceptional, because I knew both taxonomies and I was looking at a number that felt wrong, which prompted me to look at where the number came from, which led me directly to the gap. If the number had been in a plausible range, I would probably not have looked at the classification index at all. The error would have survived another session. That is also something to think about. I checked my data against the Terran Naval Register on my tablet. The Terran Naval Register is a public document. The classification of the reserve fleet under active reserve, combat ready, is in it. The distinction between active reserve and auxiliary support is explained in a footnote to Section 4 of the Fleet Classification Standards, which is also a public document. The footnote is 73 words long. It says, in the plain administrative language that standards documents use, that reserve, in the Terran naval taxonomy, denotes maintained combat capability with reduced deployment tempo, distinct from the auxiliary category, which denotes support and logistical functions without primary combat assignment. 73 words. The Vethori assessment had 60% of the Terran Navy in the wrong column because a 73-word footnote in an ancillary standards document had not been reconciled with the Vethori classification framework. I sat in the shuttle and looked out the window at the station growing larger against the dark, and I thought about whether I was reading this right. I checked it twice more. I was reading it right. Then I thought about what to do about it, which is the part of the story that I think about the most when I think about that morning. I was a grade 4 records officer, observer delegation. I was there to take notes. Marin Voss was the diplomatic representative. Anything involving the substance of a council session was her territory, not mine. Flagging errors in official documentation was also, in one interpretation of the role breakdown, her territory. In another interpretation it was mine, because I was the records officer and catching errors in documents was the most fundamental part of my job description. What I decided in the end was that the correct thing to do was to share the information with Voss and let her decide what to do with it, because Voss had 19 years of diplomatic experience, and I had 11 years of archival experience, and the situation required both. I sent her a message on the internal consulate channel flagging the classification discrepancy and attaching the relevant sections of the Terran Fleet Classification Standards footnote. I sent it before the shuttle docked. She replied 4 minutes later, 2 words seen it. I put my tablet away and got ready to walk into the council chamber. The diplomatic gallery of the Vethori Primary Council chamber sits above and behind the council floor, separated by a privacy screen that is, I should note, entirely transparent to sound and moderately transparent to light, which is not what privacy screen suggests, but is apparently what it means in Vethori architectural tradition. From the gallery I had a clear view of the council floor, the central projection field, and all 53 council members arranged in their tiers. I had been assigned to gallery attendance as part of the Terran observer delegation, which in practical terms meant I sat in the second row with my data tablet and took notes. Marin Voss sat in the first row, directly above the rail that overlooked the council floor. Marin Voss was 47 years old, had been in the diplomatic service for 19 years, and had the particular physical stillness that very experienced diplomats develop when they are in rooms where they are waiting for the right moment to do something. She was not tall, not imposing, not the sort of person who drew the eye in a crowd. She wore the standard gray of the Terran diplomatic corps. She had a data tablet on her knee and a stylus in her right hand, and she had not moved the stylus once in the 40 minutes since the council session opened. The session had opened, as Vethori sessions do, with an extended formal acknowledgement of all parties present, their credentials, their delegations, and the date according to 4 different calendar systems used by member species of the Conclave. Then there was a reading of the previous session's notes, a confirmation that the notes were accurate, a confirmation that the confirmation was accurate, and a procedural motion to proceed to the day's primary agenda item. The primary agenda item was listed, in the formal session document I held in my hands, as Review of Terran Candidacy Assessment, Comprehensive Military and Strategic Capacity Evaluation, Final Stage prior to Committee Recommendation. Final Stage. I had not known it was the final stage when the session documents were first circulated. That notation had been added to the cover sheet as a morning update, which was why I had not seen it until I opened the documents in the shuttle. Final Stage, Recommendation Pending, See Attachment C, was 47 pages of classified military assessment, which I had read twice before the shuttle docked, and the cover notation I had not expected told me that whatever was happening in this session was not a preliminary review. It was the review. The vote was coming. That context made the stylus not moving more significant. The Vethori senior archivist was named Cheluvax, and he was very good at his job. He was the blackest Vethori I had seen in 3 years on the Lara, which among their kind indicated extreme seniority, and he moved across the council floor with the unhurried certainty of a person who has never been wrong about anything in a professional context and has the file records to prove it. He brought up the assessment in the central projection field. It expanded to fill the chamber, a holographic display roughly 30 meters across, glowing in the amber light that Vethori prefer for formal proceedings. It was, I will give him this, an impressive document. The Vethori had catalogued every registered Terran naval vessel above frigate class. They had cross-referenced Terran defense treaties and calculated our obligated force commitments, meaning the portion of our fleet that was contractually spoken for in existing mutual defense arrangements and therefore not available for independent action. They had assessed our weapons technology against the Conclave standard and placed it at 71% of current mid-tier capability, which is accurate. They had noted our rate of technological development, our active shipyard production, our training cycle times. They had included a section on human military doctrine and assessed our tactical flexibility as above average for a civilization at our development stage. They had included a section on human resource extraction capacity and supply chain resilience. They had a section on morale and command structure that was, I thought, the most impressive part. The Vethori had clearly read deeply in Terran military history, and their analysis of how human command culture had evolved over the past 2 centuries was more accurate than some internal Terran assessments I had processed. In every particular I could verify, they were correct. That is the thing I want you to understand. Chelovax had not made a sloppy assessment. He had not cut corners. His team had worked for 9 years and the work showed. The document was thorough, current, and correct in every particular except one, and the one particular it was wrong about was not visible from inside the Vethori taxonomy, because inside the Vethori taxonomy everything was filed correctly. Chelovax walked the council through it in sections. His delivery was precise. He never editorialized. He did not need to because the numbers did that for him. Terran active naval tonnage, excluding committed treaty obligations, came to what the assessment called Category 7, moderate regional, meaning we could defend our own home systems and project minor force into adjacent sectors, but we were not a serious concern for a power operating at conclave scale. He walked through the treaty obligation breakdown, the technological assessment, the doctrine section, the supply chain analysis. Each section was complete. Each section was correct. By the time he reached the summary, I had read the whole document twice, and I could follow along in real time, and he was not missing anything. Except the one thing he was missing, which was not in the assessment because it was in the wrong subdirectory. Several council members made notes. A few exchanged looks. Not dismissive, exactly. The Vethori were too professional for open dismissiveness, but settled, comfortable. The look of people confirming what they already believed, which after 9 years they had every reason to believe, because 9 years of evaluation had consistently produced the same picture, and the picture had consistently shown the same thing. Marin Voss had not moved her stylus. I was watching her more than I was watching Chelovax. I had already read the document. I knew what Chelovax was going to say. What I didn't know was when Voss was going to move, and if she was going to move at all, and what she was going to do if she did. There are diplomatic situations where you correct the record and situations where you allow an incorrect record to stand, because correcting it would create a different problem, and I was not the person who knew the difference between those situations. I had sent her my analysis, and she had sent back 2 words, and now I was watching her sit very still and not moving a stylus, and I was doing the thing I do in diplomatic proceedings, which is wait. When Chelovax finished the main body of the assessment, he paused, as Vethori archivists do when they have reached a conclusion they want the room to feel the weight of. Then he said, in the formal council register, that the assessment was complete, that the Terran military posture represented no significant variable in the committee's upcoming recommendation. That candidacy evaluation could proceed to the recommendation phase with full confidence in the accuracy of the inventory. Complete, full confidence in the accuracy of the inventory. He said those words, and 53 Vethori council members settled back in their seats, mandibles easy, and the council chair began to move toward the procedural close that would set up the recommendation vote. Voss raised her hand. In Vethori council procedure, the observer gallery has a formal right to submit procedural questions, but not to address the council directly. The mechanism is an electronic request that appears as a small indicator light on the council chair's display. It is intended for clarifications of process, not substance. Most Vethori council members in that chamber had probably never seen that light activate in a session of this kind. The council chair saw it and paused. Cheluvac saw it a moment later from the council floor. There was a short, precise exchange about the nature of the request, in which Voss, through the gallery intercom, her voice coming out low and even through the audio system, completely steady, said she had a question regarding asset classification procedure. Specifically, a procedural question about how the Vethori archival taxonomy handled certain Terran administrative categories. She said it in flawless formal Vethori, which I happen to know had taken her 7 years to achieve, and she said it in exactly the register that indicated this was a small clarification, a housekeeping question, nothing of substance. The tone that says, "I am sorry to interrupt, this will take 30 seconds, I would not mention it if it weren't necessary." Cheluvac, being a senior archivist, said he would be happy to address a question about classification procedure. That is what senior archivists do when a records question arises. They answer it. Records are their responsibility and their territory and their professional pride. You do not hand those off to someone else. I noticed from the second row of the gallery that Voss's stylus was moving now. She was writing as she spoke, which is the habit of someone documenting a proceeding in real time, noting the exchange verbatim for the record. Voss said, "In the Vethori military taxonomy, how were Terran reserve fleet vessels classified?" Cheluvac said the reserve fleet was classified under Auxiliary Class 3, Civilian Support Tonnage, Non-Combat Designation. Voss said, and in the assessment currently displayed, which classification columns had been included in the combat-capable inventory total. Cheluvac said, active naval, active treaty committed, active border patrol, strike capability and logistical combat support, standard military grade columns. Voss said, an auxiliary class 3. Cheluvac said, auxiliary class 3 was not included in the combat capable total. It is a civilian classification, non-combat. Voss said, could she confirm, and she was sorry to be procedurally fastidious about this. She knew the council's time was valuable. Could she confirm that in the Terran administrative taxonomy, reserve fleet vessels were classified under a different category than in the Vethori system? There was a pause. Not a long pause, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, but in a formal Vethori council session where every exchange follows a precise cadence, 3 seconds is a pause you can feel from the gallery. I watched Cheluvac's mandibles. They were still easy. He was still in the mode of answering a procedural question. He had not yet calculated where the question was going. Cheluvac said, he would require clarification on what the Terran administrative taxonomy considered the reserve fleet to be. Voss said, the Terran reserve fleet was classified under Terran Naval Administrative Code as active naval reserve status. It was fully crewed, fully armed, maintained at combat readiness, and rotated through live-fire training on a 14-month cycle. The vessels were designated reserve because they were not assigned to standing patrol routes, not because they were non-combat. She said this the way you might say that a document had been filed in the wrong drawer. Neutral, matter of fact, not unkind. Another pause. This one was longer. I watched the mandibles. Cheluvac said, and the tonnage of the reserve fleet under that classification. Voss consulted her tablet. She read a number. I had seen the number. It was in the Terran Naval Register, which is a public document available to any Conclave member with observer status, filed in the standard Conclave archival system under Terran Armed Forces, Naval Command, Fleet Disposition, Reserve Categories, Active Reserve, Combat Ready. The Vethori assessment had pulled from Terran Armed Forces, Naval Command, Fleet Disposition, Reserve Categories, Auxiliary Support. Those are two different subdirectories in the Terran filing system. In the Terran Administrative Index, the distinction between them is clear. It is explained in a footnote to Section 4 of the Fleet Classification Standards document, 73 words, which specifies that reserve in Terran naval taxonomy means maintained combat capability with reduced deployment tempo, not reduced combat capacity, and that the auxiliary category is distinct and refers specifically to support functions without primary combat assignment. The Vethori taxonomy had no equivalent distinction. In the Vethori system, reserve mapped most closely to their auxiliary class, which was non-combat. The Vethori archivists had seen the label reserve and filed it in the place their taxonomy said it belonged. They were not wrong to do so. Given the information available to them without the footnote, the filing was correct. The footnote was 73 words in a secondary standards document, 9 years of evaluation, 60% of the Terran Navy. Cheluvac stood very still. His mandibles, which had been easy and confident throughout the session, went to a position I can only describe as having no position at all. They were not tight with concern. They were not relaxed with comfort. They were held in a way that suggested his face was waiting for his brain to provide instructions, and his brain had not yet finished the calculation. Around him, 53 Vethori council members were in various stages of doing similar arithmetic. I could see it happen in sequence as Voss's number propagated through the room, the slight forward lean as council members reached for their own data devices, the cross-referencing against the assessment still displayed in the projection field, the moment of recalculation. The number Voss had read was not a small adjustment. The Terran Reserve Fleet was not a rounding error. Adding it correctly, moving it from Auxiliary Class 3 into the active naval column, added approximately 60% to the Terran military tonnage total in the assessment. 60%. That takes humanity from Category 7, moderate regional, to something that would require a different form to process. The projection field still showed the original assessment, the original numbers, Category 7. Voss lowered her tablet to her knee. She said she just wanted to make sure the record was accurate. She would submit the correct classification documentation through the standard diplomatic correction channel if the Council would permit. Standard Form DF7, reclassification of previously assessed assets with the supporting Terran Administrative Index as an attachment. She could have it filed within the hour. She said this pleasantly. She had the expression of someone completing an administrative task that needed completing. She was not gloating. She was not smiling. She was not doing anything other than submitting a reclassification form in the appropriate manner, through the correct channel, with the supporting documentation attached. Cheluvac said the Council would permit the submission. He said it correctly, formally, in the right register. He was a professional. His voice did not change. His mandibles did not move once while he said it. Let me tell you about the next 50 minutes, because this is the part people usually skip to the end of, and the end is not actually the most interesting part. The interesting part is the middle, which is where the arithmetic happens in the room while everyone is pretending to proceed normally. There is a Vethori administrative procedure called a session continuance verification. It sounds procedural because it is. Formally, it means the Council Chair is verifying that the session agenda can be completed in light of new information. Practically, it means the Council Chair has called a quiet hold while the senior members determine whether they still want to do what they were about to do. I had catalogued 3 previous instances of it in my archival work. It was a real procedure with a real function. The Vethori had built it into their session framework specifically for situations where documentation submitted during a session changed the evidentiary basis for a pending decision. They had built that procedure in because this kind of thing had happened before. Not to them, probably, but to someone, at some point in the long history of the Conclave, this kind of thing had happened, and the Conclave had responded by creating a formal procedural mechanism for it. That is what bureaucracies do with problems they cannot prevent. They create the correct procedure for handling them after the fact, and they file that procedure in the appropriate location, and they train their people to use it. The council chair activated the session continuance verification 8 minutes after Voss submitted Form DF7. Voss and I waited in the gallery. A junior Vethori attaché brought water, which was a courtesy the gallery did not usually receive in sessions of this kind. I assumed it was because someone on the council staff had looked at the situation and decided that the Terran delegation should be kept comfortable and that bringing water was the correct signal for that. The Vethori are thoughtful about signals. Voss drank her water. I did not drink mine. I was watching the council floor through the privacy screen. 53 Vethori. Their session documents were open in front of them. Cheluvax had stepped back from the projection field and was conferring quietly with 2 other senior archivists I recognized from the reading room, colleagues of his, the people he trusted to check his work. On the projection field, the assessment was still displayed, but now there was a second panel beside it. The reclassification documentation Voss had submitted, which the council system had automatically displayed upon receipt in accordance with standard procedure. 2 columns, side by side, the original total and the corrected total. The corrected total was larger. There is a specific quality to silence in a large formal chamber when a large number of very composed professionals are all deciding how to respond to the same piece of information simultaneously. It is not an absence of sound. There were ambient sounds, the council's ventilation system, the low hum of the projection apparatus, the occasional quiet exchange between council members who leaned together and spoke in low formal tones, and then separated again. But underneath all of it there was a stillness, a collective suspension that you could feel the way you can feel pressure change before weather. The room was holding. I have been in a lot of diplomatic proceedings. Ratification sessions, arbitration hearings, dispute resolutions, and once a formal censure proceeding that lasted 9 days and resulted in a unanimous finding and a 40-page remediation document that I drafted the filing structure for. I have sat in a lot of rooms where important things were happening at a bureaucratic pace, and the importance and the pace did not match. The rooms look the same from the outside, and they feel very different from the inside, and you learn over time to read the quality of the stillness. This was a room where something significant was being recalculated, quietly, without acknowledging that it was being recalculated, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the error, and the error was 9 years old and had been produced by the most respected archival team in the Conclave. So the room was very composed and very professional, and nobody was raising their voice, and nobody was pointing at anything, and the recalculation was happening in the private interior of 53 very experienced officials, each of whom understood perfectly what the 2 columns on the projection field meant. I thought about Cheluvax walking the council through the assessment 40 minutes earlier, the precision of it, the completeness. The word complete said 3 times. His team had worked for 9 years and the work was good, and sitting in the gallery watching the 2 columns on the projection field I felt, without quite being able to name it at the time, a specific kind of sympathy for the position he was in. He had not cut corners. He had not made a careless error. He had used the information available to him, filed it in the correct location according to his taxonomy, and produced an assessment that was accurate in every particular except the one that mattered most. The error was not in the work. It was in the gap between two systems that had never been fully reconciled, in a footnote that had never been cross-indexed, in a place where two different words meant the same thing on one side of the taxonomic boundary and two different things on the other. Nothing in his system had generated an error flag. Nothing in his methodology had surfaced a reason to question the filing. The system had processed everything smoothly and delivered clean output, and the output was exactly what the system said it was. It was just not what the world said it was. That is the most expensive kind of error, not the kind that comes from sloppiness or shortcuts, the kind that comes from a system that is too good at being consistent. When your system is perfectly consistent, it does not generate error signals. It processes everything smoothly into the correct category and produces clean output, and you have no reason to doubt it, because the doubt would have to come from outside the system, from someone who knew both taxonomies well enough to see the gap between them. I spent 3 years in the Vethori reading room. I knew both taxonomies. I had caught the gap in a shuttle on the morning of the session. The gap had been there for 9 years. Voss had seen it on the shuttle ride over the previous day. During the 22 minutes of the session continuance verification, I watched the council floor through the privacy screen and tried to read the room the way I had learned to read rooms in 11 years of diplomatic proceedings. What I observed was this. The 53 council members were not panicking. They were not in disarray. They were not doing anything that would look, from the outside, like distress. Each of them maintained the composed professional bearing that Vethori formal culture requires in a session chamber regardless of what is happening, and most of them were reading something on their data devices or speaking quietly with their immediate neighbors in the measured, low tones of people exchanging information rather than reactions. What I observed underneath that was a particular kind of focused quiet, not the relaxed quiet of a session proceeding as anticipated. The focused quiet of a room where everyone is working on the same problem simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of proceeding normally. It has a distinct texture if you have sat in enough rooms to recognize it. The slight forward angle of the posture, the speed at which pages turned, the way the quiet exchanges between neighbors lasted a specific length, long enough to compare notes, short enough not to appear alarmed. Chelovax had stepped away from the projection field and was standing with his 2 senior colleagues at a distance from the main council tiers. They were reviewing something on a shared data device, the 3 of them bent slightly toward the screen in the way that archivists do when examining a document closely. Whatever they were looking at, they had been looking at it since the first minutes of the verification hold. I could see from the angle that it was not the reclassification form. The page format was different. I thought they were probably looking at the original assessment source documentation, the raw data, the filing trail, the path by which the reserve fleet had arrived in the wrong subdirectory, working backward through their own system to understand where the gap had appeared and how it had stayed invisible for 9 years. That is what a good archivist does when an error surfaces. You do not start with the correction. You start with the source. You trace the path the error traveled, from the point it entered the system to the point it was caught, and you document every step because you need to understand the mechanism before you can fix it, and you need to fix it before it can happen again somewhere else in the archive. Chelovax was already doing that work. In the middle of a council session, during a 22-minute hold, he was already reconstructing the error trail. I thought about the 3 years I had spent in his reading room, the methodology documents I had studied, the precision of the system. He had built something genuinely excellent, and it had failed in a specific way that was invisible to the system itself, and he was the kind of professional who would want to understand that failure completely before he said anything about it to anyone. I respected that, I still do. The session continuance verification lasted 22 minutes. At the end of it, the council chair announced that in light of a pending record correction, the session would be continued to a future date, to be determined, pending processing of submitted documentation. He thanked the gallery delegation for their procedural diligence. He said diligence in the Vethori formal register, which is a word that in that context carries a specific connotation of correct professional conduct, and he said it neutrally, which was the correct way to say it, and he said it in a room of 53 council members, none of whom were looking at the gallery. We were escorted out through the gallery antechamber. The junior Vethori attaché who escorted us was young, amber in his carapace, and he walked ahead of us with the particular posture of a person doing an assigned task correctly and not thinking about anything else, which was probably wise of him. Voss collected her data tablet and her stylus and her small document bag. We walked down the long gray corridor in the Vethori preference for cool stone and amber-tinted light. Neither of us spoke. This is standard practice in corridors adjacent to council chambers, because the acoustics in Vethori architecture carry further than you expect. We reached the exterior transfer point, the small atrium where the diplomatic shuttle dock connected to the station. A shuttle was ready. We boarded. The door sealed. The shuttle began its transit to the consulate annex. I said, "You saw it on the shuttle ride over." She said, "The previous day's reading. Had it in my queue." I said, "The footnote." She said, "I read all the footnotes. Every time it's a habit." She said it without emphasis, not a lesson, just information about her process. I looked out the shuttle window at the station growing smaller. The council chamber was in there somewhere, with 53 Vethori and a projection field showing 2 columns and a 9-year error. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "They file a revised assessment. That takes however long it takes, scheduling a new recommendation session after that. We wait." I said, "The vote?" She said, "Is the vote, we'll see." She had opened a different document on her tablet, a shipping manifest from the format. She was reviewing it with the focused attention of someone catching up on work they had set aside during the session. I opened my own tablet and began updating my session notes, because session notes are time-sensitive and need to be filed while the details are current. I wrote down the exchange between Voss and Chelovax verbatim, from memory, which after 11 years of proceedings I can do with reasonable accuracy. I noted the times. I noted the procedural steps. I filed the draft in the correct location in the consulate archive with a notation for final review. It took me 40 minutes. When I finished, we were approaching the consulate annex dock. The formal announcement about the session continuance came through the standard Conclave notification channel 4 hours later. I processed the filing confirmation and archived it. The Vethori consulate staff sent a standard acknowledgement of Form DF, receipt to the diplomatic correspondence inbox. I logged the acknowledgement. These are the things that need doing when proceedings like this one conclude, and they needed doing, so I did them. There is a coda, because things of this kind have codas. The revised Vethori assessment was filed 11 weeks later. I read it the morning it arrived in the consulate archive, before I filed the receipt. It was thorough and accurate, and it reclassified the Terran Reserve Fleet correctly, under active naval reserve status, in both the Vethori and Terran taxonomies. The corrected summary figure appeared in the document summary section in the clear Vethori administrative font that Chelovax's team preferred. The figure was larger than the previous figure. The category designation had changed. There was a footnote. Chelovax had written it himself. His archival identifier was in the document metadata, and the footnote carried his formal attribution notation, which senior archivists attached to corrections of significant scope. It was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged the prior classification of Terran Reserve Fleet assets and identified the specific taxonomic mapping error. The Vethori Auxiliary Class 3 designation versus the Terran Active Reserve category, without assigning causation to any party. The second paragraph described the classification distinction as documented in the Terran Fleet Classification Standards, Section 4, Footnote 7, which it reproduced in full. The third paragraph detailed the remediation to the archival record, including a systematic re-review of all Terran naval documentation for similar mapping discrepancies, of which the review had found 3 minor additional instances, all corrected. The fourth paragraph, which was the shortest, noted that the revised assessment superseded the prior version in all particulars, and that the full archival record of both versions, with the correction documentation, was preserved in the appropriate subdirectory. I read those 4 paragraphs several times. There is a specific kind of professional satisfaction in reading a correction that is done correctly, not defensively, not minimally, but completely, with full documentation, with the source error traced and the remedy documented and the prevention mechanism built in. A bad correction tries to make the error small. A good correction makes the error clear and makes the remedy permanent. Cheluvax had written a good correction. He had not minimized it. He had not buried it. He had written it into the document clearly and attributed it clearly and filed it where it would be found, which is what you do when you are a senior archivist and your system has produced an error of this magnitude. You do not hide it. You correct it. You document the correction. You improve the system and you move forward. The recommendation vote was rescheduled 4 times over the following 7 months. This is not unusual. Recommendations of this weight and complexity get rescheduled. The diplomatic correspondence during those reschedulings passed through my inbox, and I cataloged all of it, and it is as procedurally routine as you would expect, unless you know what you're looking at, in which case you can read the sequence of escalating signatories on each rescheduling notice and understand that the matter was being elevated internally at each step, reviewed by progressively more senior officials, which in Vethori administrative culture signals that a decision is being taken seriously at the highest level. The 4th rescheduling notice was signed by the council chair's administrative secretary, which meant it had been reviewed at the very top of the committee before being sent. I filed all 4 notices in the correct subdirectory under Terran candidacy, Committee Correspondence Rescheduling Notices. It is a subdirectory that before this process had contained 2 entries, both from years earlier, both routine. The vote itself is not mine to narrate because I was not in the room. Marin Voss was. It was a closed session, no observer gallery, standard for recommendation votes at this stage. She came back to the consulate annex afterward and went directly to her office and spent 2 hours completing post-session documentation, which I know because I could see her office light from my workstation. When she was done, she came out and told the consulate staff, 4 of us in the main room at that hour, that the recommendation had passed favorably. Then she went back to her office. The formal announcement came through the Conclave notification channel 3 days later. I processed the filing confirmation, archived the announcement in the correct location under Terran candidacy, outcomes, favorable recommendations, and updated the master index. Then I sent a routine acknowledgement receipt to the Conclave Administrative Office, as required within 48 hours of notification receipt, using the standard cover template. That was, from a record standpoint, the conclusion of the matter. I have told this story a handful of times since, usually to other records officers, usually when someone is discouraged about the nature of the work, which is slow and procedural, and mostly involves sitting with documents for long hours in quiet rooms, and not doing anything that looks significant from the outside. It is hard to explain, sometimes, why this work matters. It is not glamorous in the way that certain other parts of the diplomatic apparatus are glamorous. No one writes accounts of the records officer who caught the mapping error in the subdirectory. The story, when it gets told, is usually about the diplomat who submitted the form. But Voss would tell you, if you asked her, that she submitted the form because a records officer sent her a message on the shuttle. And she would probably also tell you that she had seen it herself, the day before, during her own document review, which is true and to her credit, but also that there is a reason diplomatic missions are staffed with records officers and not just with diplomats. The two functions are different and they need each other, and neither one alone catches everything. I am not saying this to claim credit. I am saying it because the record should reflect what actually happened, and what actually happened was a team effort of the most ordinary kind, where two people with different jobs each did their job, and the jobs fit together, and the result was correct. I have thought often about Cheluvax in the years since. He remains, as far as I can determine from professional correspondence, in the same position, senior archivist, Vethori Council, unchanged in role if not in seniority. He has continued to produce assessments that are, by all accounts, thorough and precise and current. The systematic re-review his team conducted after the Terran assessment error was, by the report filed in the Conclave archival system, comprehensive and found no other errors of comparable magnitude. They mapped the full Vethori taxonomy against the administrative standards of all member species and associated candidates, cross-indexed every category and subcategory against the originating taxonomy's own classification footnotes, and documented all discrepancies. The remediation report was 231 pages long. I read all 231 pages. I am a records officer. Cheluvax and I correspond occasionally, 3 or 4 times a year, always on professional archival matters, always formally structured. He once sent me a correction to an error in a Terran document I had processed, a minor inconsistency in a treaty annexure date, off by 1 day in a calendar conversion, which had propagated through several documents before being caught. The correction was precise and attributed correctly and filed in the right location, and I thanked him for it, because that is what you do when a colleague catches an error in your work. He has never mentioned the council session in any of our correspondence. I have never mentioned it either. We are both archivists in different traditions doing the same essential job. The record is what it is. You file it correctly and you move forward. Though I will say this about the last communication I received from him. He had added a standard notation to the bottom of his professional correspondence. Not a personalized note from the phrasing, a standard notation, the kind you add to a template so it goes out on every message to a given category of correspondent. It said, "Please confirm that the classification used in any attached documentation reflects the filing convention of the originating administrative authority, not the receiving taxonomy. Cross-reference footnotes as applicable." It is a small notation. It is correct practice. If every archival team in the Conclave applied it as a standing check on incoming cross-species documentation, it would prevent a category of error that has probably caused more problems in Conclave administrative history than any other single mechanism. It takes 30 seconds to apply. It requires knowing that the gap between two taxonomies is the thing to look for, which requires having looked for it once and found it. Cheluvax had found it. He had written it down. He was sending it to every correspondent in his system. That is the most Vethori response to mistake I can imagine. Not to apologize, not to downplay. To identify the systemic failure, write the correct procedure for preventing it, and distribute the procedure to everyone it applies to, with the correct documentation filed in the appropriate location. I filed the notation in my own professional standards record, under cross-species administrative correspondence, best practices, received. Seems like the right place for it. The Vethori are exceptional archivists. Their cataloging cast is among the best I have encountered across 11 years and 11 different species, and I say that not as a qualification but as a genuine professional assessment. Their assessment of Terran military capacity was thorough and current and correct in every particular except one. The reserve fleet was in the wrong subdirectory. That is not a small error. 60% of our combat tonnage is not a rounding error, but it is the kind of error that is perfectly invisible from inside the system that produced it, which is the most dangerous kind to have and the hardest kind to catch. You catch it from the outside, from someone who knows both systems well enough to see the gap, from someone who reads the footnotes. I am not a soldier. I have never won anything in a context that would look dramatic from the outside. I sat in the second row of a gallery and watched a colleague ask a question about filing taxonomy. That is the story. But I will tell you that when the formal announcement came through the Conclave channel 3 days after the vote, and I processed the filing confirmation, and I updated the master index, and I sent the routine acknowledgement receipt using the standard cover template. At the end of all of that, when the work was done and the documents were filed and the notification sent, I sat at my workstation in the consulate annex on the Lara station, and I allowed myself, for approximately 30 seconds, to look at nothing in particular and not do anything. Then I closed the Terran candidacy index and opened my inbox and started on the next item in the queue, which was a routine manifest discrepancy that had been sitting there for 3 days and needed processing. The work is never finished. That is not a complaint. That is the point of the work. If it were ever finished, you would not need anyone to do it. You would also not need anyone to read the footnotes. Someone has to read the footnotes. In 11 years of this work, I have not found a better description of the job than that. Someone has to read the footnotes. That is the whole thing. That is all of it.